Hi everyone, I'm going to walk you through problem C2-29. I like this problem because it covers a lot of concepts in chapter 2, including the concept of 351 non-taxability, where a transferor transfers property in exchange for stock of a transferee corporation, and how we determine basis of both the stock that the transferor receives and also the basis of the property to the transferee corporation, as well as the holding periods of both the stock and the property. And this also has an interplay where one of the transferors is contributing services instead of property in exchange for her shares of stock, and how that plays with interplays with 351. So it's a good problem to kind of get down a lot of concepts, and I advise that after you look at this video and you're starting to do the homework problems, that you actually open up to the page of the book, pages of chapter 2 that pertain to this problem, so that you can kind of read the rules as you walk yourself through the problem. It will reinforce the rules so that you'll remember them. Now, our facts say that in the current year, Dick, Evan, and Fran formed Triton Corporation. Dick contributed land having a fair market value of $50,000 and an adjusted basis of $60,000 in exchange for 50 shares of Triton stock. Evan contributed machinery having a fair market value of $30,000 and a basis of $45,000 in exchange for 30 shares of stock. And Fran contributed services worth $20,000 in exchange for 20 shares of stock. So all in all, 100 shares of stock were received by the three. And we know that under 351, control has to have occurred after the exchange takes place, and control is defined as at least 80% ownership of all classes of voting stock by the transferors immediately after the exchange of property in exchange for their stock. And if they qualify, and if those rules are met under 351, then the exchange is non-taxable. And that's important because normally when you give up property, you're going to have not only a realized gain, but a recognized gain or loss. So we like when we can make 351 work for us. So in this case, what is the amount of Dick's recognized gain or loss? First of all, we need to know what his realized gain or loss was. His land had a realized loss of 60 minus 50, or $10,000. And does he recognize any of that loss? Does 351 come into play here? So we know that under 351, contribution of services does not qualify towards the 351 transfer requirement. So we have to disregard Fran's contribution of services and her receipt of 20 shares of stock. But in total, we say that Dick and Evan received 80 shares out of the total 100 shares received by the three of them. So Dick and Evan actually control 80% of the corporation after the exchange. So this indeed does qualify as a 351 transfer with regard to Dick and Evan's transfer of property. So in this case, Dick will recognize no loss. Next, we need to determine Dick's basis in his Triton shares. And the basis in the shares is going to be the same as the basis in the land. He gets a substituted basis in the shares of the corporation equal to his basis in the land that he gave up. So his basis is going to be $60,000. His holding period is going to be a carryover in the holding period as well. He bought the land 3 years ago, So his holding period is going to be 3 years. Next, we have to go through the same exercise with regard to Evan's transfer of the machinery. Evan realizes a loss of $15,000, which is the $30,000 fair market value minus $45,000 adjusted basis. So he also transferred lost property. And that's going to be important when we look at the basis of the property in the hands of the transferee corporation. So he realizes a $15,000 loss. And does he recognize any of that? No, because it qualifies as a 351 exchange with regard to his transfer of property also. And then we have to determine his basis in the stock, and it's going to be the same as the basis in his machinery. And he bought that machinery 4 years ago. So there we go on that. Next, we go through the same exercise with regard to Fran's transfer of services. And we know that the transfer of services does not qualify as a 351 non-taxable exchange. So she actually realizes a $20,000 gain upon transfer of her services, because those services have no basis to her, but she actually receives $20,000 worth of stock, right? Because the services are worth $20,000, and she's actually going to recognize ordinary income. It's going to be a W-2 that she's going to receive for that of $20,000. And then her basis in the Triton shares is going to be the same as the she's going to actually get a basis equal to whatever she recognized as income. So, and her holding period starts the date after the exchange takes place. And that's just the rule. Just remember that that's the rule. Not necessarily a rhyme or reason to it, but she never had any basis in those services, and so it makes sense that the holding period is going to be a new holding period. And the only question in your mind would be then, does it start the day after the exchange, or does it start the date of the exchange? The reason I think that it starts the date after the exchange is because I think the midnight rule comes into play with regard to 351 transfers. So the 351 transfer isn't deemed to happen until midnight, the end of the day on the day that the transfer takes place. And so the holding period would start the very next day. It would start midnight of the next day. Then we have to determine what the basis in the land and the machinery is to Triton, the corporation. And Triton's basis in the land is going to be equal to Dick's basis in the land minus a reduction of $10,000 equal to his realized loss. And that's because we don't want to double up on any losses that might be realized in some future year. So the IRS requires us to reduce our basis by $10,000. So they're actually the Triton Corporation's going to have a basis of $50,000, and the holding period in this case begins the date after the exchange takes place. And same with the machinery, that's also lost property. So it's going to be a $45,000 adjusted basis minus $15,000 reduction for the loss, the built-in loss. So they're going to have a basis, the corporation's going to have a basis of $30,000, and the holding period is going to be deemed to start the date after the exchange takes place. And then what do we do with the services that Triton pays to Fran for her services? So the Triton's basis in the services would be zero if they actually expense those services. But in the case where they actually capitalize the services, which they likely would in the year that the corporation was formed, and that's covering another, some concepts that we haven't learned yet. But and you can read about it in the book, it talks a little bit about capitalization versus expensing of those services that are provided. But in the case where the services were capitalized in the formation year, then they do get a basis of $20,000, and their holding period would begin in the current year in which the services are provided. So we've completed this question. I hope that helps you guys, and I'll talk to you guys soon.